Hey, I'm Alex. I had fun making today's episode, which is about Karens who really thought they could bring their arrogance to Everest without repercussions. From a lady who repeatedly tore her oxygen mask off just to scream at her guides, to a woman who blew past every single turnaround window her team had set. And trust me, that is not where her story ends. It was May 17th, 2016, on the south col of Mount Everest. A wind-stripped saddle at 26,000 feet, where the temperature that evening was falling below -20. The thin air doesn't announce what it's doing to a person. It just quietly disassembles them from the inside out. And by the time the symptoms are visible to anyone watching, it is already too late. Laurie Vanden was 41 and worked as a regional sales director for a pharmaceutical distribution company based in Phoenix, Arizona. She had completed several Himalayan trekking expeditions over 4 years and had summited 2 peaks above 20,000 feet through commercial, guided programs. Her Everest permit had cost roughly $65,000, a figure she referenced often enough that other expedition members later told investigators they knew the number before they knew her name. She had joined a commercial guiding operation out of Kathmandu and arrived at base camp in early April with gear that was mostly still tagged on arrival. She had no prior experience above 24,000 feet and had never spent a night in the death zone. Her lead guide had flagged concerns about her acclimatization pace to FETA operations staff during the rotation weeks. She pushed back on rest days repeatedly. Other team members described her as someone who treated the mountain the way she treated quarterly targets, as a problem to be solved through force of will, not biology. By 6:30 p.m., wind gusts were reaching 40 miles per hour across the col, and the temperature had dropped sharply since late afternoon. Most climbers had retreated to their tents for rest before the planned pre-dawn summit push. Laurie had not. Witnesses told investigators she had been moving between tents for roughly an hour, verbally expressing dissatisfaction with her tent assignment, cursing at her guide, and the pace of logistical preparations on a mountain where pace is dictated by survival, not preference. Eric Valois later described seeing Laurie pacing near the edge of Camp 4 around 7:40 p.m., already on supplemental oxygen, but repeatedly pulling her mask off to argue, exposing herself to air that barely sustained consciousness, let alone physical exertion. Each removal made her breathing faster and shallower. Eric said he called out to her twice. She did not respond to either call. I personally think the first time she pulled that mask off to make a point, it significantly worsened her hypoxic state and reduced her chances of recovery. Tashi, the Sherpa guide assigned to the expedition, saw her attempt to walk unassisted toward the fixed rope line. Her movements had gone erratic. She planted her trekking pole at the wrong angle and stumbled sideways, overcorrecting with her upper body. Her speech had deteriorated into fragmented sounds that Tashi later described as words that didn't connect into anything he could follow. Within 2 minutes, she dropped to her knees. Eric, watching from roughly 30 feet away, noted her hands clawing at the snow. Not deliberately, but reflexively, the way a body reaches for something solid when it no longer trusts itself. She attempted to stand twice. Both times her legs failed to coordinate beneath her. Then her arms began jerking in irregular, poorly coordinated movements, consistent with severe neurological impairment. The oxygen mask had slipped off again and hung from its strap against her shoulder. In the headlamp beam, Eric described her face as dark and mottled, the color leaving it unevenly. A thin line of saliva had frozen at the corner of her mouth. She continued to move without coordinated control. No cry, no call, just the wind in her limbs moving against the snow. Doria reached her in roughly 90 seconds and attempted to reseat the mask and hold it against her face, but she was already unresponsive. Her breathing came in shallow, irregular intervals, each one further apart than the last, difficult to detect in the wind. She fell forward, face first into the snow, still gripping her trekking pole so tightly that her knuckles remained locked around the grip. As she stopped moving entirely, she was already dead. The post-expedition medical review identified the cause of death as high-altitude cerebral edema with concurrent high-altitude pulmonary edema, brain swelling and fluid accumulation in the lungs, progressing simultaneously in an environment where intervention was not possible. Her family filed a formal complaint against the guiding company in the months that followed, citing inadequate supervision. The lead guide provided documentation of 3 separate written advisories issued to Laurie during the expedition, each recommending she halt or delay progression. The complaint was not upheld. I can look at every piece of documented evidence in this case and reach only one conclusion. The guides did their job. What they could not do was make her listen. This next story, just a year later, same mountain, different face, same exact mindset. And the outcome was almost identical. It was May 21st, 2017, on the southeast ridge of the world's highest peak in the Himalayan range of Nepal, where a fixed rope queue had stalled for over 40 minutes at the Hillary Step. The combination of commercial crowding, extreme altitude, and one unclipped carabiner was already in the process of becoming fatal. Maribel Kaplan was 38 and worked as a regional sales director for a pharmaceutical distribution company in Houston, Texas. She had taken up mountaineering in her early 30s following a divorce, progressing through technical peaks in South America and Central Asia over 5 years. The summit had been a publicly announced goal posted on her company's internal blog 2 years prior. She paid a commercial guiding company roughly $60,000 for the permit, logistics, and summit attempt. She arrived at base camp 8 weeks earlier and completed 2 acclimatization rotations. Already frustrated with the slow pace and convinced she deserved priority, she muttered complaints under her breath, voice sharp enough that fellow climbers 2 positions away glanced over with annoyance. The former Hillary Step area, in busy season, functions less like a climbing challenge and more like a single-file bottleneck, with lethal consequences for any uncontrolled movement. The fixed ropes anchored along its face are the only barrier between a climber and a drop of several thousand feet off the exposed ridge. At roughly 28,700 feet, the human body operates on a fraction of sea level oxygen, and the impairment to both judgment and fine motor, coordination is measurable and well documented. On this particular morning, 11 climbers were compressed onto terrain that comfortably accommodates 3. Temperature sat near negative 20 degrees Fahrenheit, with sustained winds of 30 miles per hour. By 6:10 a.m., Maribel had been stationary on the ledge for nearly 45 minutes. By now, her impatience had escalated into open irritation. She jabbed her ice axe against the ledge, huffing audibly and glaring at climbers ahead of her, occasionally snapping at the guide to move faster. Stefan Brauer, a 44-year-old German climber with 2 prior Himalayan summits, was positioned roughly 6 feet above her on the fixed rope. Below her, a Nepali high-altitude guide named Nima Sherpa was managing the group's spacing. The ledge at that section was barely 2 feet wide, ice-coated rock with a clean vertical drop on the downhill side. At approximately 6:15 a.m., the queue stalled again. Maribel unclipped from the fixed rope. Stefan, looking down at that moment, called out for her to stop. She moved sideways regardless, attempting to pass 2 climbers directly above her. Personally, I think exhaustion stops being a background detail at this exact moment and becomes the actual cause of everything that follows. Her crampons scraped audibly against the mixed ice and granite surface as she shifted her weight laterally. One crampon failed to bite. Her left foot swung outward and found no purchase. The slip was immediate. Her arms came out to both sides, no rope within reach, no surface to catch against. She fell backward between 30 and 40 feet and struck an exposed rock outcrop head first before coming to rest on a sloped ice shelf below. The impact was visible to at least 3 climbers above. Her helmet split along the right side on contact. Blood spread across the ice beneath her head within seconds. Her body moved once, a single involuntary contraction, then went completely still. Stefan called out. A second climber above him immediately began calling down to Nima. Nima reached her within minutes. He found no breathing and severe cranial trauma visible beneath the fractured edge of her helmet. Given the extent of visible injuries and the altitude, no resuscitation attempt was considered viable. I find it hard not to think about what happens if she simply stays clipped to that rope for another 10 minutes. That thought doesn't go anywhere, but it doesn't leave either. She was confirmed dead before any medical team reached her. The report concluded death occurred at the scene. Maribel's company posted a tribute on their internal platform 2 days after news reached Houston. The summit photograph she had promised to share with her team was never taken. What I keep returning to is that the guiding company's post-season incident documentation categorized this under client decision. And the framing, more than anything else in this story, is the most honest thing they probably ever said about how commercial high-altitude operations actually work. One mistake in that story caused a sudden death. Meanwhile, for the next one, the mountain didn't take her suddenly. It took her slowly, and everyone around her could see it happening in real time. It was May 14th, 2016, on the balcony, a wind-scoured shelf at 27,500 feet on Everest's southeast ridge, when Talia Bren, fuming and impatient, complained loudly about the slow idiots ahead of her, tapped her crampons impatiently, and demanded everyone let her pass, a 2-minute rest turning fatal in the thin air. Talia was 38, a self-assured earth science teacher from Portland, Oregon, who believed she knew more than the guides and apparently resented anyone questioning her judgment. She had only a handful of technical climbs to her name: easy Cascades routes, a single Aconcagua summit, and 2 aborted Himalayan attempts where the guide said later that she blamed the weather rather than her lack of experience. She had never attempted a true high-altitude push without supplemental oxygen. I personally think that for her, Everest was less a goal than a trophy she felt entitled to conquer. Preparation for Talia was more about appearances than skill. She carried a pulse oximeter and logged readings obsessively, but only to prove to herself and others how capable she was. She had been vocal about summiting without supplemental oxygen, dismissing guides' warnings as unnecessary, and she openly criticized climbers who relied on bottles. On summit night, the emergency oxygen bottle was recovered from her pack, valve closed, unused, despite repeated offers from guides to help her use it. The death zone, above 26,000 feet, is a clinical designation, not a dramatic one. At that altitude, oxygen partial pressure falls to roughly 1/3 of sea level. The brain deteriorates before the body does, and in ways the person experiencing it cannot reliably detect. Judgment degrades first. A climber can report feeling sharp while visibly impaired to everyone nearby. The body compensates through faster breathing and elevated heart rate, which simultaneously drains fluid reserves and accelerates exhaustion. No acclimatization replaces what the air simply withholds. Talia reached the balcony just before 5 a.m., roughly 7 hours into her summit push with no supplemental oxygen. A Spanish climber named Dario Vela, moving just ahead of her, glanced back at her brash comments as she complained about useless Sherpas slowing progress, and ignored every caution about pacing. She swayed while seated, barely noticing the tilt. When asked how she felt, she waved him off, saying she was fine, with a tone that suggested annoyance rather than honesty. Her lips were noticeably darker than normal, but she dismissed it as a minor inconvenience. I'll be honest, that one detail told me exactly where this story was going before I even finished reading it. Within minutes, Talia stood abruptly and went still. She stared forward without fixing on anything. Her breathing became audible, uneven, labored, carrying a faint wet quality that experienced high-altitude climbers associate with fluid collecting in the lungs. She began producing fragmented phrases that neither Dario nor the Sherpa guide beside him could interpret. Her movements became uncoordinated, and she struggled to keep her balance. Then she stepped sideways and went down into the snow without bracing herself. Dario and the Sherpa, a man named Pemba, reached her immediately. Her body had gone fully slack. No resistance, no self-support. They managed to get her partially upright before her weight shifted back. Her eyes opened once, briefly, without tracking either of them. Her lips had deepened to a blue-purple visible even in low light. Pemba reached for her emergency oxygen bottle and worked the mask toward her face. Her breathing had already reduced to slow, widely, all spaced gasps. The mask was positioned but produced no meaningful response beneath it. Frost was forming along her nostrils and across her eyelashes. The gasps continued to space further apart. Pemba radioed base camp at approximately 5:08 a.m. Given their position on the route, any response team would have required several hours to reach them under those conditions. Talia became fully unresponsive within several minutes of collapsing. Sustained manual attempts to assist her breathing produced no recovery. The expedition report later listed the presumed cause of death as hypoxic brain injury. secondary to severe high-altitude cerebral and pulmonary edema, with secondary cardiac arrest. In plain terms, the brain and lungs filled with fluid, oxygen saturation dropped below the threshold for consciousness, and the heart stopped. No traumatic injuries, equipment undamaged. The oxygen bottle in her pack was full. Her school held a service the following month. The expedition leader released a terse statement noting her choices were deliberate. Fellow climbers remembered her arrogance and refusal to heed warnings. What makes this story chilling is that Talia knew the risks, carried the tools to survive, and still dismissed them at every stage. Her final acts were not ignorance. They were the result of overconfidence and entitlement. That gap between knowing and acting, fueled by arrogance, is what ultimately killed her. For the next one, the climber didn't just think she was fine. She told her team the weather was fine and walked out into a whiteout. It was May 19, 2014, at Camp 4 on a high-altitude expedition's peak in the Nepalese Himalayas, a cluster of tents pressed into compacted snow at roughly 26,000 feet, where the wind doesn't just blow, it dismantles. 3 climbers rested intermittently on supplemental oxygen through what became one of the quietest disasters the expedition would ever document. Nobody heard her go. Nobody heard anything after. Riva Solmund was 38 years old and worked as a structural engineer at a mid-sized consulting firm in Oslo, Norway. She had been climbing for 14 years, alpine routes through Scandinavia and the Alps before moving to the 8,000ers. This was her 3rd attempt at this summit. The first 2 had been turned back by weather, and she spent both trips loudly complaining about guides and stupid restrictions. Her teammates described her as controlling, someone who cross-referenced forecasts across 3 separate services, lectured constantly about their supposed errors, insisted on checking anchor placements herself, despite lacking real skill, and carried a laminated checklist she wielded like a badge of authority. She had taken 6 months of unpaid leave to prepare, though people said that much of that time was spent fussing over gear brands and arguing with trainers about why she deserved a personalized acclimatization plan. She was not strong and not quick, but she demanded the team follow her pace and listen to her advice. Her summit bid was planned for midnight on May 20th. At approximately 10:30 p.m. on the 19th, she left the tent, scowling and muttering about tent mates who slowed her down, insisting she needed air and couldn't wait for anyone else. The South Col is a flat, exposed saddle of glacial rock and ice with no natural windbreak in any direction. At 26,000 feet, jet stream winds can exceed 100 miles per hour without significant warning, and temperatures at night fall below minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Cognitive function at that altitude degrades measurably. Spatial reasoning deteriorates, reaction time slows. And critically, none of it feels the way it sounds from sea level. The body keeps moving, the mind just doesn't keep up. Lucen watched her headlamp move away from the tent line. Wind at that point was roughly 25 miles per hour, manageable for the elevation. Over the next hour, conditions shifted hard. Wind climbed past 60 miles per hour, temperature dropped further, visibility collapsed near zero. He called from the tent entrance twice. No response came back. At approximately 11:10 p.m., a climber in a nearby tent briefly spotted a faint light moving low to the ground, not tracking toward the fixed ropes or the camp perimeter, but erratic, close to the snow surface. It lasted a few seconds, then it was gone. That detail, one witness, a few seconds, is essentially all that exists of what happened to her in real time. The snow the next morning filled in the rest. Reva had walked less than 90 feet from the tent before her footprints began to lose direction. Spacing widened, the line drifted. Hypoxia at that altitude produces disorientation functionally indistinguishable from severe intoxication, and it compounds rapidly with cold. Her oxygen mask was found partially dislodged. A single glove was recovered approximately 10 feet away. I've read enough high-altitude incident summaries to know that 90 feet sounds like nothing, and that is precisely the problem. Beyond the glove, the stride marks transitioned into shallow drag impressions consistent with crawling. Based on depth and spacing, investigators estimated that movement covered roughly 15 feet before stopping entirely. Her body was found at approximately 6:40 a.m. by Lucen and 2 other expedition members, less than 100 feet from camp. She was face down, knees tucked beneath her torso, upper body folded forward. Ice had accumulated across her face and neck in dense, layered deposits consistent with several hours of exposure to sustained high-velocity wind. No distress signal had been activated. A mountain rescue liaison was notified by radio at 6:55 a.m. Her body was secured and relocated a short distance from the active camp area later that day due to conditions at that altitude. The expedition medical report later attributed the cause of death as fatal hypothermia with contributing hypoxic impairment. Everyone who knew Riva used roughly the same words: arrogant, controlling, overconfident. She lectured constantly, insisted on being right, and flaunted knowledge she didn't truly have. And still, less than 100 yards from shelter, in a storm that moved faster than any model had predicted, none of it mattered. That's the part most people don't absorb. The mountain doesn't negotiate with entitlement or attitude. All right, for the next one, this lady was already past the point of no return before anyone realized it. And by the time they did, there was nothing left to give her. It was May 23rd, 2018, on the upper flanks of a peak in the Khumbu region of Nepal, where the summit ridge sits above 27,000 feet, and the atmosphere holds roughly 1/3 the oxygen available at sea level. A place where the human body does not survive so much as it slowly stops functioning. Denise Carreau was 41 years old and worked as a structural engineer for a mid-size infrastructure firm based in Portland, Oregon. She had spent 11 years assembling what looked like a strong mountaineering resume on paper, but much of it consisted of guided climbs where she leaned heavily on others while presenting herself as the most knowledgeable person in the group. She frequently argued with guides, questioned route decisions, and dismissed safety briefings as overly cautious. However, I do think that she was not reckless in her own mind. She simply believed she knew better than everyone else. Her colleagues described her as someone who triple-checked load calculations and kept a laminated checklist taped to her desk. And she carried that same attitude onto the mountain, correcting others and inserting herself into decisions she wasn't qualified to make. She had trained for this specific climb for 3 years, altitude acclimatization rotations, supplemental oxygen drills, and 2 preparatory Himalayan expeditions in prior seasons, both of which included documented disagreements with guides over pacing and oxygen use. Her stated turnaround time was 2 p.m., the hard cutoff enforced by most experienced guides operating at extreme altitude. What investigators would later piece together is that she summited at approximately 1:45 p.m., 15 minutes ahead of the cutoff. That detail matters. It likely gave her a sense of margin she did not actually have. Descending climbers who passed her reported she was moving efficiently on the way up, but had lingered near the top longer than expected, resting, adjusting gear. By the time she turned around, it was past 2:30 p.m. Her supplemental oxygen canister, based on the flow rate logged by her guide team at base camp, had less than 90 minutes of supply remaining. Above 26,000 feet, what climbers refer to as the death zone, the human body cannot acclimatize. Cells begin dying faster than they regenerate. Cognitive function degrades within hours. Coordination, judgment, and fine motor. Control collapse in sequence, often before the person experiencing the decline is aware of it. Wind on the upper ridge that afternoon was measured at roughly 35 miles per hour with gusts near 50. Air temperature had dropped to approximately -25 degrees Fahrenheit, with wind chill pushing it closer to -35 degrees Fahrenheit. At that altitude, muscles fail under exertion that would be trivial at sea level, and the brain begins making calculations it is no longer capable of completing correctly. At approximately 3:10 p.m., a descending rope team spotted Denise near the upper ridge. A climber named Haruki, part of a separate expedition, later gave a detailed account to investigators. He described her pace as reduced to small, dragging steps, crampons scraping rather than planting, her upper body pitching forward with each movement. She was not stopping to rest. She was simply unable to move faster. Haruki said her oxygen mask was still on, but the canister gauge visible from several meters away appeared to read empty. By 4 p.m., she had descended less than 300 feet from where the rope team first spotted her. Then, she went down. Haruki described her collapsing sideways against the slope, not falling, but folding. One knee first, then her hip, then her shoulder. She tried to push herself upright repeatedly, arms shaking violently with the effort. And each time she reached a partial upright position, she came back down. Her breathing had become audible from several meters away, a high-pitched wheeze carried on the wind, a sound Haruki said he had not heard from a person before. Her oxygen ran out completely sometime around 4:15 p.m. Without supplemental flow, deterioration accelerated. Frost began forming along the edges of her goggles and across her eyelashes, as well as on her eyebrows and the hair visible beneath her helmet. Her skin, exposed at the jaw and chin, had taken on a grayish, waxy tone that Haruki noted explicitly in his account. I've read a lot of accounts like this, and the image of frost forming over someone's eyes while they're still technically alive is something that doesn't leave you. Her eyes remained partially open. Haruki attempted to connect his own oxygen line to her mask, but her responsiveness had already faded to the point where she could not grip or assist the connection. She settled into a semi-curled position on the slope, one hand still gripping the webbing of her harness. Her breathing slowed to shallow, irregular intervals. Then it stopped. Haruki radioed base camp at approximately 4:40 p.m. A rescue team from the expedition's high camp attempted to reach her position, but was turned back by deteriorating wind conditions. They reached her body the following morning. The coroner's report, translated and summarized for the family, listed the cause of death as hypoxic respiratory failure compounded by hypothermia, with contributing factors including physical exhaustion and altitude-induced cognitive impairment. No equipment malfunction was identified. Everything functioned as designed. She simply ran out of time and oxygen in that order. Denise Carreau's body was recovered 2 days later and transported to base camp. Her family declined a public memorial. Haruki gave his full account to investigators and has not spoken publicly since. Climbers who crossed her path remembered the same pattern: confidence that bordered on entitlement, a refusal to follow guidance, and a tendency to treat safety limits as optional. The 45 minutes she spent at the summit were not an accident. They were a decision shaped by that mindset. At that altitude, that difference is fatal.